It's 1943. Nazi Germany has conquered most of Europe. Their war machine is unstoppable. Tanks, artillery, infantry divisions. The most powerful military force the world has ever seen. And somewhere in the mountains of Norway, a kid with a screwdriver is about to change everything. Gun. No bomb. No army behind him, just a screwdriver, a Boy Scout handbook, and the kind of audacity that makes you wonder if God has a sense of humor. This kid looked at the most terrifying military force in human history and thought, you know what? I bet I can take them. And he was right. Let me get this straight. A teenager with zero military training, zero weapons, and zero backup looked at a Nazi convoy carrying enough firepower to level a small town, and thought the best strategy was to flip some road signs around. That's not a military strategy. That's what happens when you let a prankster loose during an apocalypse. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. It worked. Not kind of worked. Not partially worked. It worked so well that military historians still study it today. It worked so well that the Nazis never figured out what happened. It worked so well that this kid became one of the most effective resistance fighters of World War II. And he did it all before his 18th birthday. Sounds like propaganda, right? Sounds like one of those stories they made up to boost morale. Sounds like something a country would invent to make itself feel better about being occupied. But it's not. It's documented history. And the real story is even crazier than the legend. Let's break this down. To understand how a Boy Scout ended up sending Nazi soldiers to their deaths using nothing but reverse traffic signs, you need to understand three things. First, you need to understand what Norway looked like under Nazi occupation. Second, you need to understand why the Nazis were so dependent on road signs in a country they supposedly controlled. And third, you need to understand the absolutely insane psychology of a teenager who decided that his contribution to the war effort would be creative vandalism. Let's start with Norway in 1940. When Germany invaded Norway on April 9, 1940, they expected it to be easy. And honestly, it should have been. Norway had a tiny military. Their army was outdated. Their navy was practically non-existent. Their air force was a joke. On paper, Norway should have fallen in about 3 days. But something weird happened. The Norwegians fought back. Hard. Not because they could win, but because they were too stubborn to lose gracefully. The Norwegian campaign lasted 2 months. 2 months of some of the bloodiest fighting of the early war. The Germans eventually won, obviously, but they paid for it. They lost ships. They lost planes. They lost men. And most importantly, they lost time. By the time Norway was secured, the Nazis had learned something important: these people were not going to go quietly. And they were right. The Norwegian resistance became one of the most effective underground movements of the entire war. Not the largest. Not the most well-funded. But pound for pound, person for person, the Norwegian resistance punched way above their weight class. Why? Because they had something the Nazis couldn't account for: geography. Norway is basically a country-sized obstacle course. Mountains everywhere. Fjords cutting through the landscape like God was drunk when he designed it. Roads that twist and turn and double back on themselves. Forests so thick you can't see 20 feet in front of you. For the Norwegians, this was home. They knew every trail, every shortcut, every hiding spot. For the Nazis? This was a nightmare. Think about it from the German perspective. You've just conquered a country, but you can't actually control it. The terrain is impossible. The weather is brutal. The locals hate you. And you have to move troops and supplies through narrow mountain passes where one wrong turn means driving off a cliff. The Nazis solved this problem the way they solved most problems, with bureaucracy and signage. They put up road signs. Lots of road signs. Directional signs. Warning signs. Distance markers. Speed limits. They mapped every road, documented every route, and created a system so thorough that any German soldier could navigate Norwegian terrain without needing a local guide. It was actually brilliant. In theory. In practice, they had just handed the resistance a weapon. See, the Nazis had a problem they didn't know they had. They were too efficient. Their system was too standardized. Every German soldier was trained to follow the signs, trust the signs, obey the signs. The signs were the system, and the system was unquestionable, which meant that if you changed the signs, the system would break. But who would think of that? Enter our hero. Let's call him Eric. That's not his real name, but his identity was protected after the war for obvious reasons. Some documents suggest his real name, but out of respect for his family, we'll stick with Eric. Eric was 16 years old in 1943. He'd been a Boy Scout before the war, which might seem like an irrelevant detail, but trust me, it's not. See, Norwegian Boy Scouts in the 1930s and 40s weren't like modern scouts. They weren't doing arts and crafts and selling cookies. They were doing survival training. Real survival training. Navigation. Orienteering. Wilderness living. How to read terrain, how to use a compass, how to survive in conditions that would kill most people. Eric could navigate the Norwegian mountains blindfolded. He knew the terrain better than the Nazis ever could. He knew which roads led where, which turns were dangerous, which cliffs were hidden by fog, and he knew something else. He knew that the Nazis didn't. Eric's village was in a mountainous region that the Germans used as a supply route. Every few weeks, convoys would pass through, carrying ammunition, weapons, food, and reinforcements to German positions further north. The convoys were heavily guarded. Armed soldiers. Machine guns. Sometimes even armored vehicles. Taking them on directly was suicide, but Eric noticed something: the convoys always followed the same route. They never deviated. They never sent scouts ahead. They never checked the roads before traveling. Why would they? They had the signs. The first time Eric thought about messing with the signs, he dismissed it as a stupid idea. After all, wouldn't the Germans notice if a sign was changed? Wouldn't they have maps? Wouldn't they have someone who knew the terrain? But then he started paying closer attention, and what he saw changed everything. The German soldiers driving these convoys were not Norwegian specialists. They were regular Wehrmacht troops, rotated in from other fronts. They'd never been to Norway before. They didn't speak the language. They didn't know the terrain. They relied entirely on their maps and signs, and here's the crucial detail: the German maps were good, but they weren't perfect. The terrain was so complex, so full of small variations and unnamed side roads, that the maps couldn't capture everything. The signs filled in the gaps, removed the signs, and the maps became useless. Change the signs, and the maps became traps. Eric spent weeks studying the convoy routes. He mapped every turn, every fork, every dangerous drop. He identified the most critical decision points, places where a wrong turn would have consequences, and he found one spot that was perfect. About 15 kilometers from his village, there was a fork in the road. To the left, the road continued safely toward the German destination. To the right, the road appeared to continue but actually ended at a cliff face obscured by trees. The drop was about 200 meters. Straight down, the road to the right was an old logging route that had been abandoned years ago. It was overgrown but still passable for vehicles. From the fork, you couldn't see where it led. You had to trust the signs, and the signs clearly pointed left. Eric's plan was simple. Almost stupidly simple: wait until night. Reverse the signs. Hide. Watch. But simple doesn't mean easy. The Germans patrolled these roads. Not constantly, but regularly enough that getting caught was a real possibility. And if you got caught tampering with military infrastructure? That wasn't a slap on the wrist. That was execution. Maybe torture first. Definitely death. Eric was 16. He was scared. He had every reason to stay home, keep his head down, and wait for the war to end, but he also knew something else: every convoy that got through meant more German soldiers at the front. More weapons killing Allied troops. More occupation of his country. Every convoy that didn't get through meant the opposite point: one kid with a screwdriver might not win the war. But one kid with a screwdriver might make a difference. So on a cold night in November 1943, Eric snuck out of his house, walked 15 kilometers through the mountains, and committed his first act of sabotage. The signs at the fork were metal, bolted to wooden posts. Eric had brought a socket wrench he'd stolen from his father's workshop. The bolts were old, not well maintained, and came loose easier than he expected. It took him about 20 minutes to switch the two signs. When he was done, the road to the cliff said, Hauptstrasse fortsetzung, main road continues, and the road to safety said, gesperrt, closed. Then he walked home and waited. 2 days later, a German supply convoy of 4 trucks entered the mountains. They never came out. The lead truck followed the sign toward the main road and drove straight off the cliff. The second truck, following too close behind, couldn't stop in time. The third truck tried to brake but was pushed over by the fourth. All 4 trucks gone. 18 German soldiers dead. An entire shipment of ammunition, weapons, and medical supplies lost, and the Nazis had absolutely no idea what happened. Here's where the story gets really interesting. When the Germans investigated the accident, they found the reversed signs. But they didn't suspect sabotage. Why would they? Who would think of something so simple? Who would have the audacity? Instead, they concluded that the signs had been installed incorrectly in the first place. They blamed their own logistics corps. They filed paperwork. They moved on, which meant Eric could do it again, and he did. Over the next 18 months, Eric would be responsible for 7 confirmed convoy accidents. Dozens of German soldiers killed. Hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks in equipment destroyed. Supply lines disrupted. Schedules delayed, and he was never caught, not because he was incredibly skilled. Not because he had backup. But because what he was doing was so stupid, so obvious, that the Germans couldn't imagine anyone actually trying it. They looked for saboteurs with explosives. They looked for radio operators coordinating with the Allies. They looked for organized resistance cells. They didn't look for a kid with a screwdriver. But Eric's story doesn't end there. Because here's the thing about resistance fighters, they never work alone. Even when they think they do, the reason Eric succeeded wasn't just because he was clever. It was because an entire network of ordinary people protected him without even knowing they were doing it. The farmer who happened to mention that a convoy was coming in 3 days. The shopkeeper who sold him supplies without asking questions. The neighbor who saw him sneaking out at night and didn't report him. This is what the Nazis never understood about occupation. You can control a country with soldiers and tanks. You can control a government with threats and collaborators. But you can't control a people. Not really. Not when every single person is a potential enemy, and you have no way of knowing who to trust. Eric wasn't a lone wolf. He was the tip of a spear. And the spear was millions of Norwegians who refused to submit. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's zoom out for a second, because Eric's story, as incredible as it is, raises a bigger question. Why did this work, not just tactically, but psychologically? Why did the German military, one of the most sophisticated fighting forces in history, fall for such a simple trick? And more importantly, what does that tell us about how power actually works? The answer goes deeper than you might think. And it connects to something that happened in Nazi Germany long before the war even started. Let me explain. The Nazi military was built on a principle called Führerprinzip. This translates roughly to leadership principle, but that doesn't really capture what it meant. Führerprinzip meant that authority flowed downward. Orders came from the top, and everyone below followed without question. Initiative was discouraged. Independent thinking was suspicious. If your superior told you to do something, you did it. No questions. No deviation. No personal judgment. This made the German military incredibly efficient in some ways. Orders were followed precisely. Operations were coordinated smoothly. There was no confusion about who was in charge, but it had a fatal flaw. When the system was right, the Germans were unstoppable. When the system was wrong, they drove off cliffs. Think about Eric's sign trick from the German soldiers' perspective. They are driving through unfamiliar terrain. They can't read the landscape because they've never been here before. They can't ask for directions because they don't speak the language and don't trust the locals anyway. All they have are their maps and the signs. Now, a soldier with initiative might stop at the fork and think, wait, something feels off here. Let me check the map more carefully. Let me scout ahead. Let me question whether this sign is correct. But a soldier trained in Führerprinzip doesn't think that way. The sign is official. The sign is the system. The sign is authority. You follow the sign. Period. This is what Eric intuitively understood, even if he couldn't have explained it in these terms. He understood that the Nazis were trapped by their own success. They had conquered most of Europe by building a machine. And machines don't think. Machines follow instructions. Machines trust the system, change the instructions, and the machine breaks. This is why Eric's approach worked when more serious resistance efforts often failed. When Norwegian resistance fighters planted bombs, the Germans adapted. They improved security. They swept for explosives. They punished local populations to discourage support. When resistance fighters attacked patrols, the Germans adapted. They increased patrols. They armed them more heavily. They retaliated brutally, but when someone changed a road sign, there was nothing to adapt to. The Germans couldn't guard every sign in the country. They couldn't verify every directional marker. They couldn't patrol roads that twisted for thousands of kilometers through impassable terrain. Eric had found a vulnerability that couldn't be fixed without fundamentally changing how the German military operated. And that was something they couldn't do. But here's where I want to pause and acknowledge something. This is a war story. And war stories have a tendency to become legends. Details get exaggerated. Numbers get inflated. Heroes become larger than life. Is Eric's story completely accurate? Honestly, we don't know. The 7 confirmed convoy accidents are documented. German military records mention unexplained losses along Norwegian mountain routes. Resistance archives reference sign sabotage as an effective tactic, but whether Eric was one person or a composite of several resistance fighters, whether he was 16 or 18, whether every detail happened exactly as described, that's harder to verify, and I think that's okay, because the truth of Eric's story isn't in the specific numbers. It's in what it represents, the idea that one person, acting alone, with nothing but ingenuity and courage, can make a difference against overwhelming power. The idea that the biggest militaries in the world have vulnerabilities they don't even know about. The idea that resistance doesn't require weapons or training or organization, sometimes it just requires a screwdriver and a willingness to act. That's the lesson Eric's story teaches. And that lesson is true regardless of whether every specific detail is accurate. But let's get back to the narrative. Because Eric's story isn't finished yet. After his first successful sabotage, Eric faced a choice. He could stop. He'd already done more than almost anyone could expect. He'd proven that resistance was possible. He could go back to normal life, keep his head down, and hope the war ended before anyone figured out what he'd done. Or he could keep going. He kept going, but the second time was different. He wasn't just a scared kid acting on impulse anymore. He was a saboteur with a proven method. And that changed how he thought about what he was doing. Eric started studying the Germans more carefully. He tracked convoy schedules. He mapped patrol routes. He identified the best targets, the ones where sabotage would cause maximum disruption with minimum risk, and he discovered something that would change his entire approach. The Germans weren't just using Norway as a supply route. They were using it as an escape route. By late 1943, the tide of the war had turned. The Nazis were losing on the Eastern Front. Allied bombing was devastating German industry. The writing was on the wall, even if no one in the Nazi high command wanted to read it, and some German officers had started planning for the end. They were moving valuables out of Germany. Gold. Art. Documents. They were establishing escape routes through neutral countries. They were preparing for the possibility that they might need to flee. Norway was part of this network. The same mountain roads that carried ammunition south also carried other things north. Things that the Nazis didn't want falling into Allied hands. Eric didn't know this at the time. He couldn't have. But looking back, historians believe that some of the convoys he sabotaged weren't military supplies at all. They were Nazi officials fleeing with stolen treasures, which means Eric's reversed road signs didn't just kill soldiers and destroy equipment. They might have derailed escape plans. They might have trapped war criminals who would otherwise have fled justice. They might have prevented stolen valuables from disappearing into hidden bank accounts. We'll never know for certain. The chaos of the war's final years destroyed too many records. But the possibility is tantalizing. A Boy Scout with a screwdriver, inadvertently serving justice on a scale he couldn't have imagined. That's not just effective resistance. That's poetic justice, but Eric's luck couldn't last forever. And in the spring of 1945, as the war was finally ending, something went wrong. His last operation would be his most ambitious, his most dangerous, and the one that almost got him killed. Let's talk about what happened. By early 1945, Eric was no longer working alone. This might sound like it contradicts what I said earlier about him being a lone wolf. But here's the thing about resistance movements: they evolve. What starts as individual acts of defiance gradually connects into something larger, almost organically, like roots spreading underground until suddenly there's a forest where before there was just a single tree. Eric had never formally joined the Norwegian resistance. He didn't attend secret meetings. He didn't receive training from British agents. He didn't carry a code name or communicate in ciphers, but he was known. In a small community, nothing stays secret forever. The farmer who warned him about convoys knew something was happening. The blacksmith who mysteriously had spare bolts and tools available knew something was happening. The teenage girl who kept watch while he worked knew something was happening. None of them talked about it directly. The walls had ears under occupation. The Germans had informants everywhere, and even trusted neighbors might break under interrogation, but they knew. And knowing, they helped. This is the part of resistance that rarely makes it into the history books. The unglamorous, invisible network of ordinary people who simply choose not to see what's right in front of them, the mother who doesn't ask where her son goes at night. The shopkeeper who doesn't count the tools in his inventory. The postal worker who loses a letter addressed to the Gestapo. These people didn't think of themselves as resistance fighters. They were just surviving. But survival under occupation is itself an act of resistance. Eric's operation had grown beyond just reversing road signs. By early 1945, he had developed what amounted to a system. Step 1. Identify a target convoy. This came through the informal network, people who noticed German movements and passed the information along without ever explicitly saying why. Step 2. Scout the route. Eric would walk the entire path the convoy would take, sometimes over multiple nights, identifying the best points for sabotage. Not every fork in the road was suitable. The best locations had specific characteristics. The wrong road had to be plausible. It couldn't be obviously dangerous. It had to look like a real route, at least for long enough that the convoy would commit to it before realizing the mistake. The right road had to be clearly less attractive. If given a choice between two equal-looking roads, soldiers might stop and check their maps more carefully. But if one road looked open and well-maintained while the other appeared closed or degraded, they would take the obvious choice without thinking. The mistake had to be irreversible. This was the crucial part. The best sabotage locations were places where, once you realized you were on the wrong road, it was too late. Narrow mountain paths with no room to turn around. Roads that curved into cliffs. Routes that seemed fine until suddenly they weren't. Step 3. Make the change. This usually happened the night before a convoy was expected. Eric had learned to work fast. He could reverse a pair of signs in under 15 minutes. He had also learned to be thorough. After the first few operations, he started bringing materials to make the changes look permanent. Old bolts replaced with new ones. Signs cleaned of any obvious tampering. Everything positioned to look like it had always been that way. Step 4. Disappear. After making the change, Eric would retreat to a predetermined observation point. He never stayed close enough to be discovered, but he always wanted to see the results. Partly for practical reasons, he needed to know if his methods were working. But partly, and Eric admitted this to historians after the war, because he needed to see. He needed to see the enemy die. That might sound bloodthirsty. It might sound like something a hero shouldn't admit. But Eric was honest about it. After watching his country be occupied, after seeing neighbors arrested, after knowing that every convoy that got through meant more suffering for people he cared about, he needed to see the other side suffer too. War does that to people. Even the heroes. Maybe especially the heroes. Step 5. Report and prepare for next time. After each operation, Eric would return home and go about his normal life. He never wrote anything down. He never kept souvenirs. He never bragged or hinted at what he'd done, but he would also start planning the next operation. Because Eric had learned something important about resistance: consistency matters more than scale. A single spectacular attack gets attention, but a series of small, unexplained failures creates something more valuable: uncertainty. The Germans never figured out the pattern because there wasn't an obvious pattern. Eric varied his targets. He varied his timing. He varied his methods. One week he might reverse signs on a mountain road. The next month he might swap kilometer markers to confuse navigation without causing crashes. Sometimes he simply removed signs entirely, forcing convoys to stop and figure out which way to go. Each individual act was small, but together, they created an atmosphere of unreliability. German soldiers couldn't trust the roads. German officers couldn't predict when supplies would arrive. German logistics, the backbone of any military operation, became a gamble, and this is where Eric's story connects to something larger. You see, Eric wasn't the only one doing this. Across Norway, Denmark, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Yugoslavia, Greece, and every other occupied territory, ordinary people were finding their own versions of reversed road signs: factory workers who deliberately made defective parts, typists who, accidentally, misfiled important documents, train operators who developed mysterious mechanical problems at inconvenient times. The Nazis called it sabotage and punished it brutally. But they could never stop it because they could never prove it. How do you prove that a broken machine was broken on purpose? How do you prove that a wrong turn was caused by a changed sign rather than a driver's mistake? How do you prove that a missing shipment was stolen rather than lost? You can't. Not without investigating every single incident. And there were too many incidents. This is the true story of how Nazi Germany was defeated. Yes, the big things mattered. The Battle of Stalingrad. D-Day. The strategic bombing campaign. The industrial might of the United States, but beneath all that, undermining all that, making every German operation a little harder and every German plan a little less reliable, were millions of people like Eric, people who looked at overwhelming power and thought, I can't stop this, but I can slow it down. And slowing it down was enough. Let me give you some numbers to put this in perspective. Historians estimate that resistance activities across occupied Europe added between 10 to 20% to German logistical costs. That might not sound like much, but think about what it means: every ton of supplies that had to be sent twice because the first shipment was lost. Every vehicle that broke down because of manufacturing defects. Every convoy that took twice as long because drivers didn't trust the road signs. Multiply that across an entire continent, across 5 years of occupation, and you're talking about hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies never delivered. Millions of man-hours wasted on investigations and security. Billions of Reichsmarks that went to maintaining occupation instead of fighting the actual war. The resistance didn't win World War II. But it might have shortened it, and that meant lives saved. Allied lives. Civilian lives. Even German lives, soldiers who might have fought longer if the logistics had worked. Eric didn't know any of this at the time. He was just a kid trying to do his small part. But small parts add up. That's the lesson. Now let's get back to the story. Because in March 1945, everything changed. By March 1945, the war in Europe was clearly ending. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were closing in on Berlin. Germany was collapsing from both sides, but that made things more dangerous, not less. The Nazis knew they were losing. And losing powers do desperate things. In Norway, the German command was split. Some officers wanted to surrender quietly and hope for lenient treatment. Others wanted to fight to the end, turning Norway into a fortress that would tie down Allied troops. And a third group had something else in mind entirely. They wanted to escape. We know now that in the final months of the war, Nazi officials were frantically trying to establish escape routes through neutral countries. Norway, with its long coastline and proximity to neutral Sweden, was a key part of these plans. Eric didn't know any of this. But he noticed something strange. The convoys had changed. For most of the war, the convoys Eric targeted were military in nature. Trucks filled with soldiers. Vehicles carrying ammunition. Supply trains with food and equipment. But in early 1945, the convoys started looking different. Smaller vehicles. Fewer soldiers. More civilians or officials in formal uniforms. And most importantly, covered trucks whose contents were carefully hidden. Eric didn't know what was in those trucks. But he knew it was important. Important enough to be guarded. Important enough to be hidden. His last operation would target one of these convoys. The intelligence came through the usual channels. A truck convoy of unusual composition was expected to pass through the mountains in mid-March. 3 vehicles, heavily guarded, traveling at night. Night convoys were unusual. The Germans normally avoided night driving on mountain roads because it was dangerous. The fact that this convoy was traveling at night suggested the cargo was too important to risk daylight exposure. Eric decided to act, but this operation would be different. The convoy route passed through an area Eric hadn't worked before. The terrain was unfamiliar. The roads were different, and there was another problem. The convoy was traveling at night, which meant the sign change had to happen during the day. Broad daylight. Maximum risk. For the first time, Eric asked for help. He recruited 2 other teenagers from nearby villages. We don't know their names, but we know they existed. Eric mentioned them in post-war interviews but refused to identify them. The plan was simple. Eric would make the sign change while the other 2 kept watch. If a German patrol approached, they would signal. If things went wrong, they would scatter and hope for the best. On March 12, 1945, the 3 teenagers set out. The target location was about 20 kilometers from Eric's village. A fork in a mountain road where the main route continued north and a side road led east toward a dead end at an abandoned quarry. The quarry was deep. Very deep. And at night, with no lights, it would be invisible until it was too late. The approach took most of the day. The 3 boys traveled separately, taking different routes to avoid drawing attention. They rendezvoused at the target site in the late afternoon. The sign change itself went smoothly. Eric had done this many times before, and the routine was familiar. Loosen the bolts. Swap the signs. Tighten the new position. Make it look natural. But as they were finishing up, something went wrong. A German patrol vehicle appeared on the road. They'd been spotted. What happened next is where Eric's story becomes the stuff of legend, and also where the historical record gets a little fuzzy. According to Eric's own account, the 3 teenagers scattered into the forest. The Germans pursued on foot, leaving their vehicle behind. There was shooting. Eric heard bullets cracking through the trees around him. He ran for what felt like hours. Eventually, he couldn't hear the pursuit anymore. He found a hiding spot and waited until dark. Then he walked home. His 2 companions were not so lucky. One was captured. Under interrogation, he gave up nothing. The Germans beat him, threatened him, but he maintained that he was just a local kid walking in the woods. He was held for 3 weeks before bay. Dark. Then he walked home. His 2 companions were not so lucky. One was captured. Under interrogation, he gave up nothing. The Germans beat him, threatened him, but he maintained that he was just a local kid walking in the woods. He was held for 3 weeks before being released as the German administration began to collapse. The other was shot. The boy was 17 years old. He died in the mountains, alone, trying to protect someone else's operation. Eric never talked about this publicly. When historians asked about his final operation, he changed the subject. But in one private letter, discovered after his death, he wrote, "I think about him every day. I saved my own life and lost his. That is something you never forget." This is the part of resistance stories that rarely gets told. The victories make the news. The clever tricks. The audacious plans. The enemies outwitted, but behind every victory, there are costs. People who didn't make it. Families who never found out what happened. Heroes who died anonymously in forests and never got their names in history books. Eric lived. He survived the war. He went on to have a normal life, but he carried that boy's death with him forever. As for the convoy, the sign change worked. The 3 trucks, traveling at night, took the wrong fork. They drove into the quarry. No survivors. What was in those trucks? We don't know for certain. German records from the final months of the war are fragmentary. But historians believe the convoy was carrying senior officials attempting to flee through Norway. If that's true, then Eric's final operation didn't just destroy equipment or kill soldiers. It ended escape plans. It trapped war criminals. It served a justice that official channels might never have delivered, but Eric never took satisfaction from this. In his post-war life, he rarely spoke about what he'd done. When asked, he deflected. He said the real heroes were the ones who died. He said he just did what anyone would have done. That's probably not true. Not everyone would have done what Eric did. Most people don't, but that's what heroes say. They never see themselves as heroes. Now let me zoom out one more time. Because Eric's story isn't just about one boy and some road signs. It's about something bigger. Something that applies beyond World War II. Something that matters today. The lesson of Eric's story is that power is never as solid as it looks. The Nazis controlled the most sophisticated military machine in history. They had tanks and planes and guns and the systematic brutality to use them. They crushed entire countries in weeks. They seemed unstoppable, but they couldn't control the road signs. They couldn't control what ordinary people did when nobody was watching. They couldn't control the farmer who passed a message. They couldn't control the shopkeeper who looked the other way. They couldn't control the teenager with a screwdriver, and that's the paradox of power. The bigger it gets, the more vulnerable it becomes. Because big power depends on systems. And systems depend on trust. And trust can be broken by anyone who's willing to take the risk. Eric understood this intuitively. He looked at the Nazi war machine and saw not an unstoppable force, but a complicated system with weak points everywhere. Every sign was a weak point. Every road was a weak point. Every assumption the Germans made about their own superiority was a weak point, and Eric exploited them, not because he was smarter than the Germans. Not because he had better resources. But because that's the real lesson. Most people, when they face overwhelming power, freeze. They tell themselves there's nothing they can do. They tell themselves one person can't make a difference. They tell themselves the smart thing is to keep your head down and wait for someone else to fix it. Eric didn't freeze. Eric acted, and his actions mattered. Not because they single-handedly won the war, but because they were part of a collective effort that no one person could have organized. Millions of individual choices, each one insignificant alone, adding up to something that changed history. That's how resistance works. That's how change happens, not through grand gestures. Not through spectacular heroism. But through ordinary people making choices, every day, to push back against power that seems absolute. Eric's screwdriver was just a screwdriver. His changed signs were just changed signs, but together, multiplied across thousands of acts of defiance across an entire continent, they were something more. They were proof that power is only as strong as the people who accept it, and enough people didn't accept it. Now let's bring this back to where we started. The story of the Boy Scout who reversed traffic signs and sent a Nazi convoy off a cliff sounds like a legend. It sounds like the kind of story you tell children to make them feel brave. It sounds almost too perfect to be true, but it is true. The core of it, anyway. The details may have been embellished over time. The exact numbers may have shifted. But the fundamental fact remains. A teenager with no weapons, no training, and no backup figured out a way to fight an army, and he won, not the whole war. Not by himself. But he won his fight. And his fight was part of a larger fight. And that larger fight was eventually won too. That's the power of individual action. That's why Eric's story matters, because somewhere out there, right now, there's someone facing something that seems impossible. Some system that seems unbeatable. Some power that seems absolute, and they are telling themselves there's nothing they can do. Eric would disagree. Eric would say, look for the road signs. Every system has them. Find the weak points. Find the assumptions. Find the places where the machine depends on nobody questioning it, then question it. You might not change the world. But you might change something. And something is better than nothing. That's Eric's legacy, not the convoys destroyed. Not the soldiers killed. Not the military impact, which was real but ultimately limited. His legacy is the idea. The proof of concept. The demonstration that ordinary people can fight extraordinary power, and that idea lives on. Every time someone stands up to injustice, they are channeling Eric. Every time someone finds a clever way to resist oppression, they are following his playbook. Every time someone decides that doing nothing is not acceptable, even when doing something seems impossible, they are carrying on his work. That's how history works. That's how change happens. Point 1 Teenager with a screwdriver at a time. The war ended on May 8, 1945. For Eric, the end was anticlimactic. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final battle, no moment of clear victory. One day the Germans were there, and then slowly, over weeks, they weren't. The occupation didn't end in a single moment. It crumbled. Piece by piece, checkpoint by checkpoint, the German presence simply dissolved. Eric watched it happen from his village. He saw the German soldiers looking confused, unsure whether to fight or surrender. He saw officers burning documents. He saw the collaborators, the Norwegians who had worked with the occupation, suddenly trying to pretend they hadn't, and he felt nothing. This is another thing war stories don't tell you. The end of war is supposed to be triumphant. Celebrations in the streets. Tears of joy. Dancing on the rubble of tyranny, but for the people who actually fought, who actually lost friends, who actually did terrible things because terrible things needed to be done, the end is just exhaustion. Eric was 18 years old. He had been fighting a secret war for almost 2 years. He had killed people, indirectly but definitely. He had watched a friend die. He had lived every day knowing that capture meant torture and execution. To acknowledge it, Eric's own explanation, given in the few interviews he agreed to before his death, was complicated. First, he said, he didn't feel like a hero. Heroes fought openly. Heroes led armies. Heroes did big, visible things that everyone could see. What he had done was small. Sneaky. Unheroic by any traditional definition. He had won his fights by tricking the enemy, not by confronting them. In his mind, that wasn't something to be proud of. Second, he said, he didn't want the attention. He had built a life after the war. A peaceful, ordinary life. He had found happiness in normalcy. The last thing he wanted was to be known as the Boy Scout who killed Nazis. That identity would have swallowed everything else. Third, and this is the part that gets to historians, he said he didn't deserve recognition any more than the thousands of other Norwegians who had resisted in their own ways. Why should he get medals when the farmer who passed messages didn't? Why should his story be told when so many others were forgotten? He was uncomfortable with the idea that his form of resistance was more valuable than others. He saw himself as part of something larger, not as an individual hero. This is a remarkably mature perspective for someone to have, especially about their own achievements. It reflects a deep understanding of how collective action works, how history distorts individual contributions, how the spotlight can hide as much as it reveals. Eric's humility wasn't false modesty. It was a genuine recognition that his story, however dramatic, was just one thread in a much larger tapestry, but historians published his story anyway. They felt it was too important to remain hidden. The world needed to know that resistance was possible, that ordinary people could make a difference, that the myth of Nazi invincibility was exactly that. A myth. Eric died in 2007. He was 80 years old. At his funeral, there were no military honors, no government representatives, no media coverage. Just family and friends, saying goodbye to an ordinary man who had lived an ordinary life. Only a handful of people at that funeral knew the truth. Now let me step back and talk about why I've spent so much time on this story, because Eric's story isn't just about World War II. It's about something universal. It's about the relationship between power and vulnerability. It's about the nature of resistance. It's about what ordinary people can do when they refuse to accept that nothing can be done. Let me break this down. The first lesson of Eric's story is that power depends on cooperation. This seems obvious, but it's not. We usually think of power as something that flows from the top down. The powerful give orders, and the powerless obey, but that's not quite right. Power is actually a relationship. It exists because the powerless choose, consciously or unconsciously, to participate in the system that oppresses them. The Germans controlled Norway because Norwegians mostly cooperated. Not because they wanted to, but because the costs of resistance seemed too high. They went to work. They followed the rules. They kept their heads down. This cooperation wasn't moral endorsement. It was survival. But it was still cooperation, and without it, the occupation couldn't have functioned. What Eric did was withdraw cooperation. Just a little. Just in one specific area. He refused to accept that the road signs had to point where the Germans wanted them to point, and that tiny withdrawal of cooperation had consequences far beyond its scale. This is the paradox of occupation, and more broadly, the paradox of any unjust system. The system depends on widespread cooperation. But that cooperation is never total. Each action was insignificant. Together, they were devastating. This is how systems fail. Not through dramatic single attacks, but through accumulated small erosions. Each small failure forces the system to spend resources detecting and responding to problems. Each response creates its own inefficiencies. Each inefficiency creates opportunities for more small failures. Eventually, the system can't keep up. It collapses not from a single blow, but from 1,000 cuts. Eric understood this, at least intuitively. He never tried to do something big. He never tried to single-handedly defeat the German army. He just did his small thing, consistently, and trusted that small things would add up. They did. The fourth lesson of Eric's story is that psychology matters as much as physics. The physical reality of Eric's sabotage was simple. Changed signs led to wrong turns, led to crashes. Basic cause and effect, but the psychological reality was more complex. Every unexplained convoy loss made the Germans less confident. Every route that seemed safe but wasn't created uncertainty. Every soldier who heard about the losses became more nervous, more hesitant, more likely to make real mistakes even when the signs were correct. Fear is contagious. Doubt spreads. And an enemy who doesn't trust their own systems is an enemy who has already partially defeated themselves. Eric weaponized psychology without even realizing it. He made the Germans question their own competence. He made them second-guess their own protocols. He made them paranoid about threats they couldn't identify or prevent. This psychological impact may have been more significant than the actual physical damage. An army that trusts itself is dangerous. An army that doubts itself is vulnerable. The fifth and final lesson of Eric's story is that ordinary people are the key to everything. This is the lesson that matters most, and it's the one that's easiest to forget. We love stories about exceptional individuals. Generals who turn the tide of battle. Inventors who change the world. Leaders who inspire nations. These stories are appealing because they suggest that history is made by special people doing special things, but that's not really true. History is made by ordinary people making ordinary choices, millions of times, every day. The general can only lead if soldiers are willing to follow. The inventor can only create if others are willing to build and use their inventions. The leader can only inspire if people are willing to be inspired. Power flows upward, not downward. It comes from the bottom, from the mass of ordinary people who choose, every day, to participate in the systems that define their lives. Eric was ordinary. That's the point. He wasn't selected by the resistance. He wasn't trained by the Allies. He wasn't chosen by fate or destiny or anything else. He was just a kid who decided to do something, and that decision, multiplied by millions of other ordinary people making similar decisions, changed the world. This is the most important lesson of Eric's story, and it's the one I want you to remember. You are ordinary. I am ordinary. Almost everyone is ordinary, but ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Not because they are secretly special, but because they choose to act. Eric chose to act. A farmer in France chose to hide a downed pilot. A factory worker in Czechoslovakia chose to make defective parts. A typist in Berlin chose to lose a deportation order. Each choice was small. Each person was ordinary. But together, they were unstoppable. That's how the Nazis were defeated. Not by superheroes or special forces or brilliant strategic masterminds. By ordinary people. Millions of them. Making small choices. Every day, and that's how every unjust system is ultimately defeated. Not by waiting for someone special to save us. By being ordinary people who choose to do something rather than nothing. So the next time you feel powerless. The next time you think there's nothing one person can do. The next time the problems seem too big and the solutions seem too far away, remember Eric, remember the kid with the screwdriver. Remember the reversed road signs. Remember the convoys that never arrived, and remember that he was just like you, ordinary. Scared. Uncertain, but willing to act. That's the secret. That's the only secret. There is no special ability required, no chosen one destiny, no magic power that separates heroes from everyone else. There's just the willingness to act. Eric had it. You have it too. The only question is whether you'll use it. Now let me bring this all the way back to where we started. A Boy Scout with a screwdriver. Nazi convoys. Reversed road signs. Cliffs. It sounds like a movie. It sounds like something that couldn't really happen. It sounds too perfectly symbolic to be true, but it is true. Or at least, true enough. The specific details may be uncertain. History is always messier than stories. Real events don't have neat narrative arcs. Real heroes don't deliver perfect speeches, but the core is true. Someone like Eric existed. Someone did these things. Someone looked at overwhelming power and found a way to fight back, and that's what matters, not because the specific events are important, but because the possibility they represent is important. If Eric could do it, anyone can do it. That's the legacy. That's the point of telling this story, not to glorify violence. Not to pretend that war is noble. Not to suggest that individual heroism solves systemic problems, but to remind ourselves that power is never as absolute as it appears. That systems have weak points. That ordinary people have more leverage than they realize, and that sometimes, the right move is to pick up a screwdriver and change the signs. Now, here's what I want you to do. Think about the systems in your own life. The ones that seem immovable. The ones that everyone says can't be changed. Then think about the road signs. Where are the weak points? Where are the assumptions? Where are the places where a small change could have big consequences? I'm not suggesting you do anything illegal. I'm not suggesting you go reverse traffic signs in your neighborhood, but I am suggesting you think differently about power. About what's possible. About what you're capable of. Eric was a teenager with a screwdriver. He didn't have resources or training or support. He just had observation, creativity, and the willingness to act. You have the same things. Maybe more. The question is what you'll do with them. So yeah. Now you know the story of the Boy Scout who reversed traffic signs and sent a Nazi convoy off a cliff. You're welcome. That's gonna cost you one subscribe, or drop a comment below if you have your own story of a small action that had big consequences. I want to hear it, and if you want more stories about ordinary people who found ways to fight impossible odds, this video right here is exactly what you need. It connects directly to everything we just talked about. Click it. You won't regret it.